For many Americans, the cost of living crisis is often discussed in abstract terms. Inflation rates, economic indicators, and market trends dominate the conversation. But for households across the country, this crisis is not theoretical. It is experienced in grocery aisles, at checkout counters, and in quiet decisions made at the dinner table. Food, once a predictable and manageable expense, has become a source of ongoing uncertainty. Prices rise faster than wages. Portions shrink without notice. Credit is used to cover essentials that were never meant to be financed. These changes do not happen all at once. They unfold gradually, reshaping daily life in ways that are easy to overlook but impossible to ignore. What makes this moment different is not just how expensive things have become, but how deeply these costs have penetrated the routines of ordinary people. Full-time workers, middle-class families, and dual-income households are adjusting their behavior simply to keep up, not to get ahead, not to improve, just to maintain. This is not a story about personal failure or poor financial choices. It is a story about a system that has quietly shifted the burden of survival onto individuals while presenting that shift as normal. And to understand how this happened, we have to look beyond headlines and numbers and examine how the rising cost of food is changing the lived reality of American households. For the past few years, Americans have been given a single explanation for why groceries feel unbearable at the checkout line: inflation. One word: simple, clean, convenient. It sounds technical enough to end the conversation and vague enough to avoid deeper questions. Prices are up because inflation is up. End of story. But for millions of households, that explanation no longer matches reality. If this were just inflation, grocery prices would rise roughly in line with income. Painful, yes, but manageable. What Americans are experiencing instead is something far more destabilizing. Food prices have accelerated faster than wages, faster than minimum wage adjustments, and far faster than income growth for retail workers, service employees, and blue-collar laborers. The gap between what people earn and what food costs has widened to a point where groceries are no longer a predictable expense. They have become a financial variable filled with uncertainty. This is not simply about higher numbers on a receipt. It is about a structural shift in how basic survival is priced. Over the last 5 years, many workers saw wages increase modestly, if at all. Some received small annual raises that barely kept up with rent. Others saw no meaningful change in income, especially those paid hourly or working multiple part-time jobs. At the same time, grocery prices surged in ways that felt sudden and relentless. Staples that once felt affordable week after week now fluctuate unpredictably. A routine shopping trip can cost dramatically more than it did just months earlier, without any change in buying habits. That mismatch is the core problem. When food prices rise faster than wages, groceries stop functioning as a stable necessity. They turn into a source of ongoing financial stress. Families can no longer budget with confidence. The same cart of items does not carry the same cost from one month to the next. This instability forces people to constantly reassess what they can afford. Not just in terms of lifestyle, but in terms of daily nutrition. For many working Americans, grocery shopping has quietly shifted from a routine errand into a recurring moment of anxiety. This anxiety does not come from extravagance or poor financial planning. It comes from the realization that no matter how disciplined spending becomes, the math no longer works the way it used to. Cutting discretionary expenses does not offset a grocery bill that rises independently of income. Skipping entertainment, eating out less, or canceling subscriptions does little when food itself absorbs a growing share of take-home pay. The result is a subtle but powerful psychological shift. Groceries are no longer seen as a fixed, manageable category. They are treated like an unpredictable bill, similar to medical expenses or emergency repairs, something that must be approached cautiously, item by item, with constant recalculation. This is why the term inflation feels insufficient to so many people. Inflation implies a broad economic condition that affects everything evenly. What Americans are experiencing at the grocery store feels targeted, immediate, and personal. Food is rising in cost faster than the ability to earn, and that imbalance strikes at the most basic level of security. When a society reaches a point where feeding oneself feels financially unstable, the issue is no longer just economic. It becomes existential. Groceries were once one of the few remaining constants in household budgeting. Rent might increase, healthcare might fluctuate, gas prices might swing, but food was something families believed they could plan around. That assumption is breaking down, and when that stability disappears, it reshapes how people perceive their financial future. This is why the conversation cannot stop at inflation. Because what is happening is not just about prices going up. It is about the cost of living being restructured in a way that places basic survival further out of reach for working Americans. And once groceries become a source of chronic financial stress, the foundation of everyday life begins to erode. Across the United States, millions of people are still working full-time. They wake up early, commute, clock in, and put in the hours expected of them. On paper, they are doing everything right. Employment numbers may suggest stability, but daily life tells a very different story. Because while these workers are still employed, the way they are forced to live has changed fundamentally. Wages have increased, but only slightly. In many cases, the raises workers receive are symbolic rather than transformative. A small hourly bump, a modest annual adjustment, or no raise at all once inflation and deductions are accounted for. These increases do not reflect the real cost pressures households are facing. As a result, people are not choosing to change how they shop. They are being pushed into it. One of the first changes appears quietly, almost invisibly. Shoppers begin switching brands. Familiar names disappear from carts, replaced by cheaper alternatives. This is often framed as smart shopping or being flexible, but the reality is more uncomfortable. These switches are not about preference, they are about affordability. When brand loyalty becomes a luxury, it signals that income is no longer sufficient to sustain previous norms. Soon after, deeper changes follow. Fresh food becomes harder to justify. Produce, meat, and dairy items fluctuate in price and spoil quickly, making them risky purchases for households operating on tight margins. Instead, people turn to shelf-stable products with longer expiration dates. Frozen meals, boxed foods, and processed items feel safer because they reduce waste, even if they compromise nutrition. This shift is not driven by ignorance or convenience. It is driven by fear of wasting money. Protein is often the next sacrifice. Meat becomes something to ration or remove entirely. Families replace it with cheaper carbohydrates that provide calories at a lower cost. Rice, pasta, bread, and instant foods begin to dominate meals. These substitutions are not part of a planned lifestyle change or a dietary trend. They are economic decisions made under pressure. The goal is no longer balance or health. The goal is to make food last until the next paycheck. This pattern repeats across income levels that were once considered secure. Retail workers, service employees, warehouse staff, and skilled laborers all experience the same narrowing of options. They are not cutting back because they want to save for something better. They are cutting back because the existing system no longer supports the life they were already living. What makes this shift especially significant is how normalized it has become. These changes are often described as adjustments, hacks, or temporary sacrifices. But for many households, there is nothing temporary about them. Once spending habits are forced downward, they rarely rebound. The new baseline becomes permanent, even as workloads remain the same. This is not a minor downgrade. A downgrade implies choice, flexibility, or trade-offs made willingly. What is happening instead is a systemic reduction in living standards. People are working the same hours, often under the same or greater pressure, yet receiving less in return. The reward for full-time labor no longer guarantees access to fresh food, dietary variety, or nutritional stability. Over time, this erodes more than physical health. It reshapes expectations. When people stop believing that hard work will allow them to maintain a basic quality of life, something fundamental breaks. The promise that effort leads to security weakens, replaced by a quieter assumption. Survival now requires constant compromise. This is how economic decline often unfolds in developed countries, not through sudden collapse, but through gradual adjustments that push households to accept less while doing the same amount of work. Grocery shopping becomes one of the clearest indicators of this shift. Because when full-time workers can no longer afford the same food they once did, the issue is no longer about personal budgeting. It is about a system that is slowly redefining what normal living looks like. And for many Americans, that new normal is noticeably far more fragile than they were ever led to expect. For many Americans, grocery prices feel confusing in a very specific way. Sometimes the price tag has not changed, yet the product feels different. The package looks familiar. The brand name is the same. But something about it no longer lasts as long as it used to. This experience is not accidental. It is the result of a practice that rarely receives the scrutiny it deserves. Shrinkflation. Shrinkflation occurs when companies reduce the size, quantity, or quality of a product while keeping the price the same. On the surface, it creates the illusion of stability. Shoppers see a familiar number on the shelf and assume little has changed. But in reality, they are paying more for less, often without realizing it until much later. Unlike direct price increases, shrinkflation operates quietly. Packages become slightly smaller, portions are reduced by a few ounces, or ingredient formulas are adjusted to lower production costs. These changes are subtle enough to avoid immediate backlash, yet significant enough to improve profit margins. For consumers, the impact accumulates over time. A box that once provided several meals now runs out sooner. A bag of snacks that used to last a week is empty in a few days. A family that has not changed its eating habits suddenly finds itself shopping more often. The price did not go up, but spending did. This is how shrinkflation reshapes household budgets without ever appearing on a receipt as a price hike. The psychological effect is critical. Consumers are conditioned to watch prices, not weights or serving sizes. When the number on the shelf remains unchanged, people feel reassured. They assume their budget is intact. Shrinkflation exploits this instinct. It allows companies to raise the effective cost of food while avoiding the emotional resistance that comes with visible price increases. Over time, this creates a sense of confusion and self-blame. Shoppers may feel as though they are mismanaging money or consuming more than before. In reality, they are responding to a system designed to extract more value from them without transparency. The burden of adjustment falls entirely on the consumer, who must stretch smaller quantities across the same number of meals. Quality reductions add another layer to this problem. In some cases, products are not just smaller, they are different. Cheaper ingredients replace higher quality ones. Nutritional value declines. Taste and texture subtly change. These shifts are rarely advertised, yet they directly affect how people eat and what they are able to provide for their families. The food still looks the same on the shelf, but its role in daily life has been diminished. For working families already under pressure, shrinkflation compounds existing stress. Budgets that were carefully planned begin to fail without a clear reason. Households are forced to buy more frequently or supplement meals with additional items, increasing total spending. What appears to be price stability is, in reality, a slow erosion of purchasing power. This is why shrinkflation is not just a marketing tactic. It is an economic transfer. Value is quietly taken from consumers and redistributed upward, without the visibility or accountability that accompanies traditional price increases. The loss is gradual, but it is constant. In the long run, shrinkflation trains consumers to accept less as normal. Smaller portions, reduced quality, and diminished value become the new baseline. The idea of what a product is supposed to provide quietly changes. And because the shift happens in increments, it rarely triggers outrage. But the result is clear. Even when prices appear stable, households are paying more to sustain the same routines. The damage is not dramatic, but it is persistent. And by the time consumers fully recognize what has happened, the standard has already been reset. There was a time when borrowing was reserved for major life expenses: homes, vehicles, education, and occasionally emergencies. Debt was understood as something taken on to build or recover. Food was never part of that equation. It was a basic necessity, purchased with cash flow, not financed over time. That assumption no longer holds. Across the United States, buy now, pay later services are increasingly being used for groceries. Milk, eggs, meat, and other essential items are now eligible for installment payments. On the surface, this is often marketed as flexibility or convenience, a way to smooth expenses, manage cash flow, or reduce short-term stress. But when examined closely, this shift signals something far more troubling. Food is not a discretionary purchase. Unlike electronics or furniture, groceries cannot be delayed or optional. People do not choose to buy food because it brings pleasure or status. They buy it because survival depends on it. When essential nutrition must be financed, it means that current income is no longer sufficient to meet basic needs. That is not innovation. It is a breakdown. The normalization of financing food fundamentally changes the relationship between households and debt. Instead of borrowing for future benefit, people are borrowing to sustain the present. This creates a cycle where tomorrow's income is already spoken for before it even arrives. Each paycheck is partially claimed by past meals, reducing the ability to handle new expenses or unexpected disruptions. This model is especially dangerous because it disguises urgency as convenience. Buy now, pay later. Systems remove immediate friction. There is no visible interest rate at checkout, no lengthy approval process, and no sense of long-term commitment. The decision feels small, almost harmless. But these payments accumulate. Multiple grocery trips, spread across weeks, quietly stack into recurring obligations. What began as a short-term solution becomes a permanent fixture in the household budget. For many families, this debt is not taken on recklessly. It is taken on reluctantly. When rent, utilities, and transportation consume most of a paycheck, groceries become the variable that must be managed creatively. Financing food becomes a way to stretch income just enough to get through the week. The problem is that this strategy relies on the future being more affordable than the present. For many Americans, it is not. The use of credit for food also changes how scarcity is experienced. Instead of confronting empty shelves at home, people confront invisible obligations. The stress does not disappear. It is deferred. Anxiety moves from the grocery store to the bank statement, from the checkout line to the next payday. This delayed pressure can feel easier in the moment, but it compounds over time. When a society reaches the point where food requires financing, it crosses a critical threshold. Basic survival becomes entangled with financial instruments designed for consumption, not necessity. The distinction between living and spending begins to blur. This is why the rise of buy now, pay later for groceries should not be celebrated or normalized. It is not evidence of consumer empowerment. It is evidence that the economic floor has dropped. When people must go into debt to eat, the issue is no longer about budgeting, discipline, or personal choice. It is a signal that the system itself is failing to support the most fundamental human need. And that is not a trend, it is a crisis. For decades, debt in America followed a familiar logic. People borrowed to acquire something lasting. A home that would appreciate over time. A car that enabled mobility and employment. An education that promised higher income in the future. Debt, while risky, was at least tied to assets or opportunities that carried long-term value. That logic has quietly collapsed. Today, a growing number of Americans are taking on debt not to build a future, but to survive the present. Credit cards, short-term loans, and digital payment plans are increasingly used to cover daily essentials. Food, gas, soap, diapers. Items that are consumed quickly and leave nothing behind once they are gone. This shift marks a profound change in the role debt plays in everyday life. When people borrow for assets, debt creates a pathway forward. There is an expectation that what is purchased will either retain value or improve earning potential. But when debt is used for consumables, it produces no return. There is no asset to leverage, no future benefit to offset the obligation. The money is spent, the product is used, and the balance remains. This is what economists refer to as non-productive debt, but the human impact is far more severe than the term suggests. Households caught in this cycle are forced into a constant state of financial catch-up. Income is no longer directed toward progress or stability. It is used to close gaps left by yesterday's necessities. Paychecks arrive already diminished, partially allocated to purchases that have already been consumed. The future is not being financed. It is being delayed. This dynamic reshapes how work itself is experienced. When labor no longer leads to accumulation or improvement, it loses its promise. People are not working towards something better. They are working to prevent collapse. Each day of effort serves to maintain equilibrium, not to advance. The psychological toll of this reality is heavy. Exhaustion increases, motivation declines, and the sense of agency erodes. The danger of survival-based debt is that it expands silently. At first, borrowing for essentials feels temporary, a short-term fix during a tight month. But as prices remain high and wages stagnate, These temporary measures harden into routine behavior. Debt becomes a permanent extension of income rather than an emergency tool. Once that line is crossed, escaping the cycle becomes increasingly difficult. This pattern is especially damaging for families with children. Expenses such as diapers, hygiene products, and transportation are non-negotiable. There is no room for delay or reduction. When these necessities require credit, households lose flexibility. Every unexpected cost becomes a threat because there is no financial buffer left to absorb it. The broader implication is unsettling. A society where people must borrow to meet basic needs is one where economic stability has been hollowed out. The appearance of employment remains, but the substance of security is gone. Work exists, but its rewards no longer extend beyond immediate survival. In this environment, debt no longer functions as a bridge to the future. It becomes a treadmill. People move constantly, expend enormous effort, yet remain in the same place. The focus shifts from building a life to managing obligations, from planning ahead to making it through the week. This is not how a healthy economy operates. And it is not a sustainable condition for a workforce expected to remain productive, engaged, and hopeful. When debt is required simply to live, the promise of upward mobility is replaced by a quieter reality. Working harder just to stand still.